Welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. Tonight we're going to be talking about the relationship between storytelling, the narrative impulse, and human survival. Anthropologists have referred to our species as homo narrans, the storytelling ape. That's because we're the only animal in all of creation that survives by creating a narrative self apart from the flesh and blood creature it is, a conceptualized me that it inhabits like a shell throughout its life. From the moment we realize that we're physically separate from the breast or arm that feeds us, generally at about 6 or 7 months old, this fictive me begins to form in our minds. This me is a child's salvation, a frame we can hang our character on, a make-believe shape that we can inhabit. We imagine that our story is a solid shell that doesn't change, our shelter, our safe house in an uncertain world. For most of us, the illusion of safety within our own story carries us through the formative years and goes more or less unquestioned as long as possible. It's only later, as we age and change and encounter adversity, when this story, this shell of me, begins to feel like a prison, and we yearn to be free of its smothering concepts, to know ourselves for who and what we are, beyond the story's limitations. As seekers, we long to know our true self, the one that precedes this me, the larger self that transcends the story-making mind and makes up the essence of who we are. But this self, this capital S self, can't be located by the mind, nor can it be found inside the margins of any story. Though our mind is the source of imagination and many wonderful things, we come to know that it is also our greatest obstacle on the path of self-knowledge. So too is this story, this imaginary me, that saved our lives once upon a time, but must be overcome if we want to be free. Luckily, this isn't as difficult as we might have thought, since this conceptual me is actually rather flimsy. Coming to inspect our story more closely in psychotherapy, through spiritual work, or simply in the natural course of aging, we discover that the thing we believe to be solid is actually more like paper mache, a slapdash collage of thoughts and labels, memories, emotions, expectations, wounds, loyalties, and make-believe, all glued together with a personal pronoun to create the fictionalized character we wish to inhabit in the world. It's like the gauze layered around the invisible man, if you ever saw the classic film with Claude Rains. Unwind the outer appearance, pull long enough at the strands of what you call me, and you discover that there's no one inside at all. There's no character that's solid and waiting to be free. In fact, the me is nothing but paper mache, a story posing as a person. This identity is useful for navigating the world in the same way a physical body is. But once we realize that the story isn't us, in the same way that we know that the body is not ultimately us, we begin to awaken as spiritual beings. The question is, how does this small me establish itself and eventually take over our lives? The mind is a pattern-seeking instrument that uses labels, assumptions, and expectations to find its way in the world. Language is the tool we use for creating these labels and concepts. Without the ability to form words that stand for other things, we could not create story. Unlike other animals that use primitive forms of communication to express emotions and survival-based directives, human language is far more advanced, enabling us to describe not only the world out there, worlds, chair, sky, mirror, objects that are visibly separate from the body, but also our interior world of feelings and imagination. Thanks to our prefrontal cortex, the human brain provides us with the juggernaut known as metacognition, the ability to think about our own feelings and to have empathy for others, to step imaginatively beyond subjective experience and describe it to ourselves as well as other people. Indeed, most of us spend our lives narrating our own existence to ourselves, describing what we see, hear, taste, smell, feel, and imagine to this make-believe me, telling ourselves stories in order to live, as Joan Didion famously put it. We each function as our own personal tour guide through the moment-to-moment adventure of being alive, like a cruise director inside our own head, interpreting reality through this narrative voice. This voiceover provides a sense of security, of being watched over, of being protected by this storyteller within, whose job it is to stay vigilant, to connect the dots, to find the patterns, and to lead us to safety. The purpose of this internal voice is to help us not feel so alone in a dangerous and uncertain world. Over time, we come to think of this narrator as our very self, using the sound of this voice in our heads as proof of our personal existence. This is what led René Descartes, the 18th century philosopher, to conclude, "I think, therefore I am." From a cognitive perspective, this is true. It's only through thinking, concepts, and labeling that the story of the me comes into existence. And only through thinking that we come to know this small self, to the degree that we can ever truly know a figment of the imagination. Thinking is what helps us to shape our own story. Growing up, we survey the world and pick and choose what we wish to adopt, deciding, I want to be this, but I don't want to be that. This is good, this is not. I'll take on this label and discard another. We blend our ideals with the limitations of what we're given at birth. And there's always a gap, as there is in any creative process, between the perfect vision we hold in our minds and what turns out to be possible. We strive to cover over this gap, to pretend to be other than what we are. Since the me is a fictional adaptation that will say and do whatever is necessary, no matter how fake or pretentious, in order to get what it wants or needs, beginning with the love of others. As the British poet W.H. Auden admitted in an essay, "Who I am is very different from the self I present in order that others may love me." Let me repeat that. Who I am is very different from the self I present in order that others may love me. As homo narrans, we're in the business of creating stories that draw people to us and gain us favor, conjuring a version of the world that suits us, slanting, shaping, coloring reality as we see fit in order to present ourselves in the most flattering possible light. Once again, we're engaged in creating the myth of me from the moment we realize that there is a body and mind that's separate from the caretaker's breast, or whatever means they use to feed us. Scared of separation and abandonment, we rush to fill the existential vacuum with story, with personal voice, reflexively, like the hungry, frightened children we are, compelled by a primal sense of confusion, injustice, and alienation, the loneliness of finding ourselves sequestered inside a separate human body. This is an important point. The egocentric me and its story begin as reactions against mortal insecurity, negativity, and fear, creating a narrative boundary between ourselves and the things that scare us, disgust us, or cause some form of aversion. This is the purpose of the terrible twos, of course, when toddlers discover the word no and the magical powers that come along with it. Each time a child says no, it is also saying yes to its own formation, its own authority, its own story. Growing up, we come to define ourselves as much by what we're not as by what we are. I'm someone who doesn't do this or that. Creating these boundaries based on no, our sense of self becomes simultaneously stronger and better defined, as well as smaller, more rigid, and limiting. Soon these no's, repeated again and again, become our personal parameters, the limited lenses through which we view ourselves. The more fixed and unassailable these tastes, opinions, and boundaries become, the more stable we tend to feel. We find comfort in knowing where we stop, who we're not, where we won't go, what we won't challenge. respecting the no trespassing signs we erect around the perimeter of our own self-image. This is also why we need rituals such as Mardi Gras and spring break and sporting events like the Super Bowl to help us transgress our tamed virtuous limitations and explore the darker sides of our nature, to let off steam and walk on the wild side. We've explored this in our conversations about the shadow. The point here is that saying no to aspects of ourselves that don't fit into the desired narrative enables us to make sense of our lives. It's how we give shape to shapelessness, meaning to meaninglessness, and certainty to life in an uncertain dimension. To cope with mystery, we create story. But story is always a partial picture based on fear and self-serving choice. A story depends on leaving things out, choosing what to include and what to delete. We're constantly filtering, highlighting, and interpreting reality, and seeking through this explained reality to understand ourselves. But since reality rarely lines up with our own ideals, and we're ever falling short of the character we wish we could be, this is often a frustrating and difficult process. Caught in a permanent state of the terrible twos, the ego is forever screaming no, no, no at reality in an ongoing tantrum of self-delusion and disappointment. This is the state in which we often find ourselves before we enter the seeker's path, defended against negativity through the power of our own denial. Let me tell you about a student of mine. We'll call him Rob. Rob was a great example of how personal fiction enables a person to survive until one day it doesn't. Rob has been a practicing psychotherapist for 20 years, an intelligent, responsible, church-going man who goes out of his way to help others and prides himself on being able to get along with anyone. Rob is an exemplary father to his 3 children, a loving husband, and a reliable friend. When he isn't taking care of his patients or attending to the needs of his family, he can be found volunteering at a homeless shelter in his hometown or coaching a little league for disadvantaged children. I like to feel needed, Rob says. Indeed, his self-image, the story he tells about himself, is based almost entirely on the roles he plays in other people's lives, roles that are intended to support, nourish, and provide opportunity, with little to no attention on himself. He considers himself blessed to be able to give and enjoys playing the Good Samaritan every chance he gets. When I first met Rob as a memoir student, these obvious virtues impressed me deeply. It's unusual to meet someone who displays this degree of selflessness. But as we began to work together, something else became obvious to me in reading Rob's story about his own life. Behind the mask of selflessness and do-gooderism, I could see that Rob was suffering. Between the lines of his feel-good tale about overcoming poverty, being the first in his family to graduate college, being born again as a Messianic Christian, and dedicating his life to helping others, was the voice of a traumatized little boy clinging to a tale of goodness and redemption that only partially covered his wounds. I heard pain, confusion, outrage, and sorrow behind the smiley-faced narrative that Rob used to describe his own life. Each time he mentioned yet again how charmed, blessed, and lucky he was, how content, optimistic, and filled with love, I heard someone who was protesting too much, overcompensating for personal darkness, with a story painted in rosy shades and presided over by flaxen-haired angels. One day I decided to take a risk and challenge Rob's well-made story. "Is that really how it happened?" I asked him, sounding as non-confrontational as possible. Rob reacted by taking the high and mighty road, explaining that this had always been his lifelong burden, convincing others, especially those who hadn't been saved, that someone with his background could actually be as happy and free as he was. There was condescension in his response, which let me know that his ego was struggling, and that my hunch was probably correct, though Rob refused to acknowledge the disconnect between his life story and the complexities of who he actually was. I encouraged Rob, in the interest of writing a truthful book, to answer a few general questions about fear, sadness, and self-esteem. Did he feel loved as a child, for instance? What were his relationships like with his parents? Did he have spiritual awareness as a child? At first, Rob balked, asking with thinly veiled distress why these questions were relevant, since he already knew what he wanted to write and who he was. Like a number of mental health professionals I've worked with, he resisted the idea that he too contained secrets that hadn't been brought to the surface and parts of himself that had gone unexamined. He went so far as to insinuate that I, lacking psychological credentials, was hardly in a position to judge him, though I'd never been judgmental at all. When I assured him that this would help his book, Rob seemed to soften a little and agreed to give these questions a shot. On the day we were to meet, I received an email from Rob canceling the appointment. He told me that he'd been feeling not himself, quote unquote, since our last session, anxious and uneasy, and that this mood had prevented him from sleeping, and that the lack of sleep had caused him to come down with something he felt was the flu. By the following week, his physical condition had improved, but his mood hadn't, and Rob once again canceled our session. Since he had made a point of telling me that he never got sick or missed a workday, I became concerned and said so. That's when I received the first verbal attack. "You might have thought of that before you asked me to answer all these flipping questions," Rob wrote back, in a tone I've never heard before. Both creatively, spiritually, and psychologically, I knew that we had hit pay dirt. I wrote back noting that Rob seemed upset and that it might be instructive and helpful to his book to find out why. He responded with a 2-word email, "I'll try," and I didn't hear back from him for another 2 weeks. When Rob finally sent in his piece, I was deeply moved by what he had allowed himself to put down on paper. Rob described how he'd been brutally whipped by his mother starting from the age of 3. His father had turned his back and left the family when Rob was in the 2nd grade. Rob's mother was erratic throughout his childhood, humiliating him in public, making vulgar remarks to Rob's friends, forgetting to buy food, and leaving Rob to pick up the physical and emotional pieces for himself and his younger sister. In spite of his mother's behavior, he adored her, though, and wrote poignantly about not being able to save her from herself or do anything at all to make her love him. Rob described being suicidal in college and reaching the point where the only way he could survive was to become everything his mother was not, to be a light in the world, a success story, to be big-hearted and selfless and irrepressibly sunny. Anything less wouldn't keep him alive, he admitted. Rob's interior darkness was so intense that only the most positive, optimistic story was bright enough to carry him from day to day. But the story was largely a sham, he now knew. In fact, he'd suspected this for quite some time, but refused to look any further. Rob realized that from a spiritual perspective, this discovery was the deeper reason for writing his book. Not merely to be a cheerleader, but to grieve a boy he'd swept under the rug, to tell the truth, finally, to accept his losses, and to relate the story that would ease his heart as well as be a beacon for other people. I hope that Rob finishes the project one day. The point is not that Rob went on to live without a story. It was simply a different story, with updated highlights, a shifted trajectory, and illuminations where there was darkness. The difference is that now he knows it's a story, and he is not the hero he's describing. He's the author of that heroic tale. He's the creator, not the creation. This awareness will help him be more fluid, curious, undefended, and open, as well as a far better memoir writer, because the story is no longer a threat to him. There's no need to nip and tuck his self-image because he knows this self-image isn't real, and the me is just a character. This is how it is for all of us. When we recognize ourselves as the author, not the fiction, the story-making process itself changes, with less emphasis on building up the doomed little me, what psychologists call reputation management, and more on becoming a mouthpiece for wisdom, a creator of beautiful things, a visionary for change and justice rather than a terrified, needy wreck struggling to hold its make-believe self together. This shift is unmistakable because there is less defensiveness, pride, and fear, and more curiosity, creativity, and willingness to take risks, to reimagine our personal story, to expand its possibilities and potentials, and inhabit our unique, ever-changing narratives as fully and as passionately as possible. So, this month I'd like you to think and write about the story you tell yourself about who you are and who you're not. Where do you draw your boundaries, the line between what's you and what's not you? How does fear drive this process? In what areas are you unable to live up to your own fiction? Do you see yourself as the character in someone else's story? In other words, one not written by you? And if so, what is that story and where does it come from? Do you see yourself as the victim rather than the actor? And where do you experience failure of the imagination? Are there creative choices you could be making but which you avoid by telling yourself some story or other? Ask yourself, what is the payoff for holding yourself back in this way? Who are the heroes and who are the villains of your life narrative? How have you managed to keep these people fixed in these roles? That's an interesting question. Perhaps beyond the statute of limitations. As homo narrans, do you see your story as an open system with outlets and windows and room for addition? Or as a closed, calcified, shrinking cocoon that is killing you rather than giving you wings? Finally, what are your authorial blind spots, the things you deny, sweep under the carpet, euphemize, leapfrog, or misrepresent? And how can you bring light to these shadows? I hope you will take some time this month to think and write about some of these questions, which are so useful in the process of awakening and self-discovery.